Alright, we're going to take some notes on multiplying and dividing integers. And we really need to understand adding and subtracting integers before we begin this. So think back to multiplying. What does multiplying really mean? Multiplying means groups of. So groups of. So for instance, 3 times 2 means 3 groups of 2. And we can write that with 3 2's. So 2 plus 2 plus 2. So we're starting off pretty simple. So 3 groups of 2, 1, 2, 3. And 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 plus 2 gives us 6. Alright, well that's not so bad at all. But we're going to get into with integers, which means including negative numbers and positive numbers. So let's try that same concept with a negative. So 3 times negative 2. Alright, so 3 times negative 2 means 3 groups of negative 2. So how do you think we would write that? Well, before I just did repeated addition, let's do the same thing. So 3 groups of negative 2, so negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2. And now I'm just going to do negative 2 plus negative 2. It's getting more negative, so it's negative 4. Negative 4 plus negative 2, it's getting even more negative, so that's negative 6. So negative 6 would be my answer to that. Alright, let's try one more example with that. What if we did a negative 3 times a negative 2? Well, that would mean that it's not 3 groups of, it's negative 3 groups of, and negative means the opposite of a positive. So the opposite of 3 groups of negative 2. So again, that word opposite is coming from this negative right here. That's telling me it's the opposite of 3 groups of negative 2. Well, how would I write that? Well, opposite of, I can use a negative sign, and I want to do the opposite of that whole value, the 3 groups of negative 2, so I'm going to use parentheses so I can represent the opposite of that whole thing. And that would be negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2. Well, we've already done negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2, and we got negative 6. But we haven't taken the opposite of that yet. So what's the opposite of negative 6? Well, you can't have a minus minus, so therefore it's got to be plus 6, or positive 6. Now take a second, look back at those 3 examples we just did. And I'm looking up here, we started off with a positive 6 when we did 3 times 2. And then we got a negative 6 when we did 3 times negative 2. And then we did a negative times a negative and got a positive 6. Do you see a pattern? Or maybe a rule that we could write? Also, do you think there's a real situation where we would deal with negative numbers when we're multiplying? The answer to that is absolutely. In fact, our government does this all the time in the form of IOUs or savings bonds. So let's say that the government sold 4 savings bonds at $25 each. Now savings bonds can get a little more complicated, but each of these represents $25. But they don't have the money because they're getting it from you, So that's going to be a negative $25, negative $25, negative 25, and negative 25. Because they don't have the money, we're going to call that negative. And four groups of negative 25, one group, two group, three group, four groups of that means that we're just adding all these together. So this is a real situation where we use every day with negative numbers. And the answer to that would be negative 25 plus negative 25 is negative 50, negative 75, and negative 75 minus 25 is negative 100. Negative $100. And savings bonds are really I scratch your back, you scratch mine. We help the government out by giving them money they need, and they end up giving us an increase in our investment. So that rate goes up over time, where we get more back than what we put in. So we earn interest on that. That's just a basic scenario of what it looks like. All right, back to that rule. Did you figure it out? All right, here it is. All right, here it is. Like signs give us a positive answer, and unlike signs give us a negative answer. All right, what does that mean? Well, let's do an example on that. All right, so for instance, we have negative 8 times negative 4, let's say. Well, before we go any further and we start calling out answers, let's look and see if those have like signs or unlike signs. I'm looking right here. This is a negative, and that's a negative. So a negative times a negative. Does that mean they're like signs or unlike signs? Well, they're both the same. So that would be like signs. So like signs give us a positive answer. So that's like. So that means our answer has to be positive. So it's a positive, and you don't have to put the positive sign. I'm just doing that for demonstration. So 8 times 4 is 32. And we know it's positive because they were like signs. Alright, so all you need to do is look at the signs. So one more example with that concept. Let's say that we have a positive 15. See, this works for multiplying and dividing. So what if we had a positive 15 divided by a negative 3? Well, let's look at the signs again. We have no sign there, which means a positive, divided by a negative. And yes, these are not going to be like signs, they're unlike signs, because one's positive, the other's negative. And we know unlike signs have to be a negative answer. So it's going to be a negative, and then what is 15 divided by 3? It's just going to be 5. So that's how that rule works. But it's nice to know why it works, which is why I showed you what I showed you about groups of and the IOUs. And now you have a rule that you can fall back on as well. But is there a shortcut though? What if I had a ton of numbers I was trying to multiply and divide, and I don't want to go through each one to figure out the sign? Well, there is a shortcut. Let's get to that. So our shortcut, why walk all the way around here if we could just go straight to point A to point B, right? So if you're thinking that, let's go ahead and learn this shortcut. So our shortcut is for multiplying or dividing many numbers or many integers. And it's as simple as counting the number of negatives. So all we need to do is count the number of negatives. If we have an even number of negatives, we get a positive answer. If we have an odd number of negatives, like 1, 3, or 5, we get a negative answer. And that's your shortcut. All right, as you finish jotting that down, I'll come up with an example. Let's say we had -8 times -4 times -1 times -3 times 2. Alright, so I don't even need to solve this. All I want to find out is, what is my answer going to be, positive or negative? So a negative times a negative times a negative times a negative times a positive. How many negatives do I have there? 4 negatives. And 4 is even. That's an even number. So that means my answer is going to be positive. It's a positive answer. It's a positive answer, and it's really going to be 192, not that you needed to know that. We're really just checking to see if it's a positive number or a negative number. Alright, let's try one more of those, and you tell me if it's positive or negative before I tell you. So write it down, and then you can pause the video and check your solution. Alright, take a second, copy down the second example, and then pause the video and try it on your own. Remember, count the number of negatives, and I just want to know if it's positive or negative. And now for the solution. Counting our negatives, that's a positive, so I don't count it. There's 1, 2, 3 negatives. Is that what you got? So 3 negatives, and that's odd, so that means it's going to be an odd number of negatives is a negative answer, so it's going to be a negative answer. Is that what you got? Well, let's go ahead and find out what it really is too. 4 times -2, I can use order of operations now, so I multiply or divide whichever comes first, and this is all multiply and divide. So I'm just going to ignore my signs right now. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 4 times 1 is 4. And 4 divided by 1 is 4. And now I'm going to use my rule to figure out the sign. So I know the answer is 4, but I know it's going to be a -4. So it's just -4 for my final answer. Not too bad, right? Just count the number of negatives. An even number of negatives is positive answer, and an odd number of negatives is a negative answer. And remember, that only works for multiplying and dividing. That rule does not work for adding and subtracting. Alright, let's do one application to this, and that will wrap up our notes for the day. So if you need to pause the video, do so, because I'm moving on. Here we go. Alright, jot down this application. The cost of housing in a neighborhood went down $45,000 from 2007 to 2011. What is the mean change per year? Alright, and that's what happened to the housing market. It went down quite a bit, and it's starting to rebound right now, but it went down quite a bit after the housing boom. So what's the mean change per year? Well, first off, our word mean is our total divided by the number of data. In this case, years. So how many years do we have from 2007 to 2011? And don't say 4, because we count 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. So that's 1 plus 1 plus 1. That's going to be 5 years. Because we include the 2007. It's inclusive. So what's our total? 45,000, but it says it went down. So what type of a number would we use to represent that? A negative. So here our total is going to be negative, so I'm going to put equals here, equals negative 45,000, fraction bar, which means divide, by 5 years. Alright, well I just learned my rules, so I have a negative divided by a positive, or I could say I have one negative. So that means my answer is going to be negative. And then 45, 5 will go into 45 9 times, and I just add these 3 zeros. And I'm going to put my dollar sign too. So that's negative $9,000. So each year it went down on average $9,000. Alright, that sums it up. And now you can enjoy your new house.